I never expected a quiet morning, a borrowed kitchen, and a familiar stranger to reopen a part of me I thought had settled for good. This is the memory of how a single conversation, gentle and unexpected, shifted the way I understood endings and beginnings in my middle years. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. That morning arrived wrapped in the kind of light that makes everything feel honest. Pale sunshine slipped through the thin curtains of my ex's house, landing softly on the worn wooden table where I sat with my hands around a mug that had long since stopped steaming. I was 47 then, old enough to know better, young enough to still be surprised by myself. I was there to pick up the last of my things. That was the plan, anyway. A box or two, a calm goodbye to a chapter that had already closed in quieter ways. My ex wasn't home, which I was grateful for. Instead, it was his friend Daniel who answered the door. I'd met him plenty of times before, always in groups, always with noise around us. He was the dependable one, the guy who fixed things without being asked, who listened more than he spoke. But that morning, standing there in a faded blue shirt, he looked different. Not younger or older, just present. "Morning," he said, his voice low and gentle, as if the day itself might bruise easily. That softness caught me off guard. I stepped inside, feeling like a guest in a place that had once been mine. The house smelled like coffee and dust, and something familiar I couldn't quite name. Daniel took the box from my hands without rushing me, our fingers barely touching, a simple moment that somehow lingered. We moved quietly, collecting books, a lamp, framed photos I wasn't ready to look at yet. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It felt respectful, like we both understood that this wasn't just about furniture. When we finally sat at the kitchen table, the same one where so many arguments and ordinary breakfasts had taken place, he poured fresh coffee and slid the mug toward me. "I'm glad you came today," he said, not looking at me at first. It felt like the right time. I studied the thin crack in the tabletop, remembering how I used to trace it with my finger when I was thinking. "It does," I replied, and I meant more than just the boxes. He asked me how I was doing, really asked, and then he waited. No advice, no fixing, just listening. I found myself telling him things I hadn't planned to say, about how endings don't always arrive with clarity, about how lonely it can feel to do the right thing. He nodded, his eyes kind, grounded. There was a moment, brief but clear, when I realized I felt seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. Not admired, not judged, just understood. It surprised me, and I think it surprised him too. The air between us held a quiet tension, not of desire, but of recognition. When I finally stood to leave, the box in my arms felt lighter than it should have. At the door, Daniel met my eyes again. "Take care of yourself," he said softly. As I walked to my car, the morning sun warming my back, I knew something subtle had shifted. Nothing dramatic, nothing improper. Just a small opening inside me, reminding me that even after loss, connection can still find you. Sometimes it speaks with a softness you didn't expect, on an ordinary morning you'll remember for years. The days after that morning moved more slowly than I expected. I told myself it was just the after effect of closure, the mind finally catching up with what the heart had already accepted. Still, Daniel's voice stayed with me. Not the words exactly, but the way he said them, as if time had widened just enough for honesty to slip through. A week later, he texted me. Nothing dramatic. Just a short message saying he found a book of mine tucked behind the hall cabinet and asking if I wanted it back. I stared at my phone longer than necessary, aware of a faint nervousness I hadn't felt in years. I told him yes, and before I could rethink it, I added that he could drop it off or I could meet him somewhere. We met at a small diner halfway between our neighborhoods, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a waitress who calls everyone honey. I arrived early, watching steam rise from my coffee, noticing how my reflection in the window looked steadier than I felt. When Daniel walked in, he smiled like he was relieved to see me, and something in my chest loosened. Conversation came easily. We talked about ordinary things at first. Work, the changing seasons, how strange it feels to realize you're closer to 60 than 40. He spoke about his own quiet routines, the comfort he found in fixing old radios and taking long walks at dusk. I found myself laughing, surprised by the sound of it. There was care in the way he spoke to me, a patience that made me feel unhurried. At one point, he paused and said, "I hope this doesn't feel awkward, us being here." I shook my head. "No," I said honestly. "It feels kind." That word seemed to settle between us. Kindness. It wasn't something I'd thought much about before, at least not as a foundation. Yet there it was, steady and real. After we finished eating, we lingered outside by our cars. The afternoon light softened the edges of everything, and for a moment neither of us moved to leave. He handed me the book, our fingers brushing again, and this time the contact didn't surprise me. It felt earned. "I'm glad we did this," he said. "No expectations, just conversation." "So am I," I replied, and I meant it more deeply than I could explain. Driving home, I noticed how calm I felt. Not giddy, not confused, just awake. It occurred to me that connection doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly, asking only that you pay attention. That night, I placed the book on my shelf and stood there for a long moment, thinking about how life continues to offer new understandings, even when you believe the lessons are over. I didn't know where this path would lead, or if it would lead anywhere at all. But for the first time in a long while, I felt open to finding out. Weeks passed, and what surprised me most was how naturally Daniel became part of my days. Not constantly, not intrusively, just enough to feel present. A message here, a phone call there. Sometimes he'd ask how my afternoon was going, and sometimes I'd ask him about a project he was working on. It felt balanced, like two people learning the shape of each other's lives without pressing too hard. One Saturday, he invited me to join him at a small community art exhibit. I hesitated before saying yes, aware of how this might look to others, or even to myself. But curiosity won. I wanted to see how it felt to stand beside him in a different setting, away from shared history and borrowed spaces. The gallery was quiet, filled with soft footsteps and muted conversations. Sunlight filtered through high windows, illuminating paintings that seemed to hold their breath. We walked slowly, side by side, commenting on colors and memories certain pieces stirred. At one painting, a simple landscape with a long road disappearing into the distance, Daniel stopped. "That one feels familiar," he said. "Like it's about choosing to keep going, even when you don't know what's ahead." I nodded, surprised by the lump in my throat. "Yes," I said. "That's exactly it." There was a closeness then, not physical, but emotional. A shared understanding that neither of us was trying to replace the past. We were acknowledging it, honoring it, and still allowing ourselves to stand in the present. Later, we sat on a bench outside, listening to traffic hum by. He told me about a long-ago relationship that ended not with anger, but with quiet acceptance. I listened, really listened, and felt a respect deepen between us. When it was my turn, I spoke about the fear of starting anything new at this stage of life, about wondering if the best parts were already behind me. Daniel looked at me with that same softness from the first morning. "I think the best parts change," he said. "They don't disappear." That stayed with me. As the sun lowered, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, I realized I felt safe. Not swept away, not uncertain. Safe to be honest. Safe to be myself as I was now, not as I used to be. When we said goodbye, it was unspoken, but clear that something meaningful was forming. Not rushed, not defined, just real. And as I drove home, I understood that growth doesn't always come from bold decisions. Sometimes it comes from allowing yourself to be gently seen and choosing not to turn away. By the time autumn settled in, I understood that what had changed in me was quieter than any label could capture. Daniel and I continued to meet now and then. Walks through the park where leaves gathered like old letters. Coffee shared without watching the clock. Conversations that wandered through memories, mistakes, hopes that felt newly possible simply because they were spoken aloud. There was no rush to define anything. At this stage of life, I'd learned the value of letting things breathe. What mattered most was the steady respect between us. The way he listened without trying to steer my thoughts. The way I felt free to say when I needed space, and trusted that it would be met with understanding, not distance. One evening, we sat on a bench overlooking a small lake, the water reflecting the fading sky. I remember thinking how much my life had narrowed after my marriage ended, how cautious I'd become. And yet here I was, open again, not because someone had pushed me forward, but because I had allowed myself to step. "I didn't expect this," I said, more to myself than to him. He smiled gently. "Neither did I. I'm glad it found us the way it did." That was the truth of it. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that broke rules or crossed lines. Just two people meeting each other honestly, at a point in life when honesty feels more valuable than excitement. As the year moved on, I noticed changes beyond him. I carried myself differently. I spoke up more. I trusted my instincts again. The experience had reminded me that connection doesn't belong only to the young or the fearless. It belongs to those willing to be present. Looking back now, years later, I don't measure that time by what it became or didn't become. I measure it by what it gave me. A renewed sense of self. A reminder that endings can lead to unexpected beginnings. That softness, when it's real, can be one of the strongest forces we encounter. That morning in the borrowed kitchen no longer feels like a turning point in a dramatic sense. It feels like a quiet door opening, and I'm grateful I didn't rush past it. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give us like and subscribe this channel.